couple of weeks ago, someone asked me how we came up with this tagline, live generously. And so I was thinking about that. I gave them the short version. It's been around about 6 years, shortly after I got here. And I was thinking about this with our staff team about 6 years ago. And I told them a story about years before I had gone and had driven past a church in Joshua Tree, of all places, a little tiny church with a sign that called itself, it said the name of the church, I don't remember what it was, and then there was a tagline that said, King James Bible-Believing Church. Which I'm not sure what that means, since Jesus didn't speak in King James English or any English at all. And while it's great to have your favorite translation, it's not exactly a statement of faith. But it does, of course, tell you what they're against, which is anything newer than 400 years old. As our team looked around, we found, of course, some much more positive taglines for churches. Better together, a great place to grow. And one person had an aunt who went to a church, a Methodist church no less, where the sign out front said, a lively liberal church. I guess they get bonus points for honesty, at least. So you know what you're in for if you go in there. But as our team thought of those, and loads of others, we kept noticing that the unspoken sentiment there was, come here, be like us. Do what we do. Join us. It was an invitation, and that's a good thing. We want to be inviting. We want to be welcoming. But it doesn't tell you much about what they are for. And, to be blunt, what's in it for you? What do you stand to gain if we join you in your spiritual journey? So our team then spent a couple of months thinking about what are we for here at Fullerton. And we thought, well, that's a good question. What is our church's underlying deep core identity? Now, you'll know some of that answer if you were here a couple of weeks ago when Karen Kellett, who is one of the founders and leaders of the Changemaker Church Initiative, was with us. And we talked about how our church came to be a part of the Changemaker Church Initiative. It's not a club we joined. It was an affiliation that was part of who we already were. From its inception, long before you or me or our parents or our grandparents, the DNA, the culture of this church has been to live generously. To put it simply, our church is more about giving than taking. It's not to say there's no taking. You should be growing spiritually and feeling enriched and feeling like you're getting better. But just as important, and maybe a smidge more important, is the spiritual aliveness and growth that happens when we become givers more than takers. Now, there's a little more to us than that. We're more about dialogue than dogma. We're more about the journey than the destination. And we're more about giving than taking. And, the pastor notwithstanding, we're more about doing than talking. It's a spiritual practice. It's an aspirational practice. Live generously doesn't announce that we have already achieved that. It's aspirational. It says, this is who we want to be. We are trying to live generously. And that's individual and it's corporate, because our spiritual practice is not just about what we do individually, what I do, what you do, singular. It's about what you, the church, do, plural, us, we. And live generously tells you in two simple words a really basic piece of information about who we are at Fullerton First United Methodist Church, and how your individual life and your life in your neighborhood and your life in this community and this church's life in this community is longing to make the kind of change that Jesus wants. Jesus, the compassionate change maker who leads us. So we live generously. In this Come to the Table series, we've heard the call to dine with Jesus, an invitation that is obviously not just about the act of eating. It never was with Jesus. The table was the place where Jesus fed people, yes, but he also fed people not at tables. He challenged people at table and around every table to acts of hospitality that reflect God's way. Now, that sounds charming. It sounds like it would make a great bumper sticker. I'm sure there's a million memes that are beautiful about that. But it's important to remember that when we say yes to a seat at this table, a place at Christ's table, we accept a life that embraces God's definition of love and grace and joy and healing. And that's a lot about who gets included when we say, come to the table. Who gets invited? Who gets a place of honor? Who serves? Jesus has so many stories. I'm sure you're already thinking of them. Stories and sayings and actions and teachings all about who's in, who's out, and how do we extend radical hospitality. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I don't think it's too far from the mark to say the direction Jesus points over and over again is to live generously. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, you can be sure I'll be there. Jesus is quoted by Matthew in the 18th chapter. And Jesus often confounded the people for whom acceptance was conditional. And every one of us has felt what it feels like to know that we are excluded because someone's idea of what was acceptable did not include us. You know what I'm talking about. Groups and churches and places and organizations where you need to dress like us and talk like us and think like us and do what we do and do it for us. You know, who's in the club, who's not. There are just some places who are all about who's in the club and who's not. And sometimes that's fine. You know, if you're having a choir, I think it's okay to have a little boundary around a choir, if you know what I mean. Not everybody belongs in a choir. Although almost everybody can clap their hands, right? You know, the litmus test for Jesus was just love. And I shouldn't say just, because that is so big, so complex, so challenging, that most of us spend a lifetime and we don't feel like we get too much closer at being the genuinely loving, caring, generous people that we feel God is asking us to be. And Jesus invites us to understand that there is great risk in that word. It cost Jesus his life. His radical hospitality was so upsetting. The state called him a traitor. They felt that his radical hospitality was traitorous. Think about that. Think about that. Who in our society today is trying to be radically inclusive and gets called a traitor? I guess it depends on who you are. So we need to acknowledge that living generously in the way of Jesus is not simple, it's not safe, and it's not easy. But it is worthwhile. And we do fall short. I happen to really like the sacramental aspect of our faith as we celebrate it together. When I'm on vacation, I typically go either to a Catholic church or an Episcopal church because I know that their worship is sacrament-centered. So even if the preacher turns out to be a dud, can't imagine it, I will get the sacrament. And everything I need will be in that. I believe that the table of the Lord is symbolic not just of our relationship with God, but our relationship with each other, our relationship with ourselves. The table of God is a table of reconciliation and healing and peace and love and joy. And it is a table of plenty, where God's abundance startles us because God's abundance gives us what we probably wouldn't even give ourselves. And so we gather not because we are worthy and not because we are worthless either. We're not. Just that we want to be a part of this business of love and loving. And we want to do that in our own individual lives, and we want to be those people. That's why we have a prayer of confession before every time we have communion. Because as a group, we say, we have fallen short. I just a few years ago had someone say to me, not anybody in our church, somebody out in the community, say, well, racism isn't my problem. I never owned any slaves. You know, that was not a conversation I wanted to have, but I thought, that is not the way of Jesus. That is not the way of Jesus. Jesus says, we all do better when we all do better. Jesus says, I am my sister's keeper. So we live generously in thought as well as deed. We open our hearts and our minds as well as our hands and our pocketbooks. A crowded table is a table of plenty with more grace than we have any reason to expect. In the face of such abundance, we are called to claim that generosity, to take it into ourselves, but also to give it away as fast as we can. Deep down inside, most of us know we fall short of what Paul asks of the Philippians. Be imitators of Christ. I cannot get there. I cannot get there. I am never going to be an imitator of Christ. But Paul doesn't really mean it like that. He means be a reflection of Christ. Be a reflection of Christ. And what does that mean? Radical hospitality, which is another name for what Jesus does over and over and over and over. He preaches it, he teaches it, he lives it, he acts it out. It's about physical hunger, heaven knows, but it's also about spiritual hunger. As I was writing this sermon, I started to list examples of radical hospitality. But I became so overwhelmed with how many different ways there were to do that I thought, if I start listing them, I'm going to leave something out, and our minds are going to get closed to what God might be inviting us to do. So I can't tell you how you can live into radical hospitality. But we can work together to be a people, a church, that lives out radical hospitality. It's an invitation to a relationship with people, with each other, with God, and it's an invitation to a kind of countercultural lifestyle. A countercultural lifestyle. You don't have to rush out and get a tattoo. But if you have one, that's okay too. It means being your real self as you live and work in the community, as you work with people who are least, the last, the lost, on the margins, as you engage with all the people in your life, you live to the degree that you can out of radical hospitality. And for sure, it means more asking than telling. And it means more walking with people than running to your own goals. And it means more giving than taking. So if you're that kind of person, or you want to be that kind of person, or you've been trying to be that kind of person and you just need some more support, or you want to be with other people who are like that, or if you've been working to make the world get that kind of a place, this is your table. And we are your people. And next week we're going to do some official joining up of people who've said, yeah, this is my people. This is the place. It's a crowded table with all of what's joyful about that. But there's plenty of room for you. And all God's people said,